So just let us read the translation of the last mantra that we pronounced, and then we will dive into it. Om, may my limbs, speech, life force, prana, eyes, ears, strength, and all my senses thrive. All is Brahman of the Upanishads. May I not negate Brahman. May Brahman not negate me. May there be no negation. May there be no negation for me. May the noble virtues, dharmas, that are expressed in the Upanishads be in me, who is engaged in the pursuit of the self, Atman. May they be in me. Om, peace, peace, peace. So in our last session, we discussed the first section of this mantra, as this mantra is divided into, one can divide it into 4 steps towards peace. And the first one is thriving of one's limbs, strengthening of one's limbs, thriving of one's speech, life force, prana, the senses, and strength, bala. This was the topic of our discussion in our previous session. Just to summarize it a little bit before we go forward. By bala, by strength, physical strength was meant. And then I also said that psychological strength is even more important than physical strength. And then most important is the yogic strength, which we can in English say the spiritual strength. And the way Patanjali speaks of strength in the yogic context, first of all, for him, practice is not, and now I'm just developing this idea a little bit. Earlier, the time was over, so I couldn't say what I'm going to say now. Practice for Patanjali, I repeatedly point this out, is not to do something again and again. For Patanjali, practice is to be with something, to be in a state. Repetition comes because we are incapable of being in that state for a long time. This simple rule is applicable to all the practices of yoga, whether it is yamas, niyamas, asana, pranayama, any limb. The simple idea of Patanjali, his definition of abhyasa, practice, tatra sthitau yatnaha abhyasa. Even in Sanskrit, generally, the word abhyasa means to repeat, to practice by repetition. And yet Patanjali's definition of this word abhyasa, even though it is very strange to me, why the word abhyasa should mean repetition, because in common Sanskrit it means repetition, but maybe yes, it is possible because it can be derived in 2 ways. It can also mean to engage oneself again and again into something. So that's why this sense, literal sense, is there. But it is strange that despite this meaning of repetition, which is otherwise commonly found in the Sanskrit application of the word, Patanjali points out that it is the effort that a person makes to remain in that state. Sthiti means state, and yatna, effort. So for him, it's not the repetition of an asana, but the very effort that we make to remain in that asana, and the longer we try to remain it, the more effort it is required to remain in it. That effort is for him abhyasa. So it completely changes the idea behind practice. That is first thing. So now, in the context of yoga, strength should be the capacity to remain in that state. So bala, from a yogic perspective, is not the capacity to do an asana repetitively for many, many times, but the strength to remain peacefully, to retain a posture. And this simple rule then has to be applied to all the different practices that are there in the 8 limbs of yoga. So whether it is yama, niyama, let us choose simply non-violence. Practice of non-violence would be the effort to remain in a mental state of complete non-violence. That effort for him is practice. And the strength to be able to retain the mental state of non-violence in the face of all the challenges that come up, that would be strength, bala, for him. So when he speaks of shraddha, enthusiasm, and then he speaks of strength, and then he speaks of mindfulness. Enthusiasm leads to strength, and strength leads to mindfulness. Smriti, exactly the same word that the Buddha uses, and therefore the Buddhist word for mindfulness, exactly the same word, arises out of virya for Patanjali, and the same thing is true also in the Buddhist meditative traditions. Completely the same idea. So first of all, that is strength. So if Patanjali speaks as a preparation for advanced meditative practices of friendliness, of compassion, of joyfulness, of forgiveness, for him strength would be to remain, the capacity to remain in these 4 Brahma Viharas, as they are called, which means, it can be translated, Vihara literally means wandering about, walking around, strolling, pastime, joyful strolling. And these 4 are referred to as the joyful pastimes of the practitioners of meditation. That is the designation for these 4. The Buddha uses the same designation, and it is a very extreme, an ancient designation to these 4, because yogic masters such as Panchashikha, which fell into the Sankhya tradition and were contemporaries of the Buddha, also used the same expression, the pastimes of the yogis, the pastimes of the practitioners of meditation. So, strength for Patanjali would be the capacity to remain in these 4. And then he also speaks of the tremendous strength that a yogi develops by being with these 4. The capacity to give, when a yogi develops the strength to remain in a state of friendliness towards all, Patanjali says that as a result, he develops a strength to give happiness, joy to all. When a yogi develops the strength to remain in a mental state of compassion for all times, then he develops the capacity to reduce the suffering of those who are suffering. This is how. So you can see the difference? Strength as a means and strength as a result. Both. Patanjali uses the word strength, virya, as a means, and the result, bala, the word that has been, both mean strength. Bala also means strength, and virya also means strength. Both are translated as strength. But Patanjali uses two different words in the context, in two different contexts. So when he uses the word virya, virility, it is an active strength that a person has to, like, it's virile. A person has to show his virility to remain in that state of friendliness, compassion, joyfulness, and forgiveness. And as a result of that, he develops another natural strength, which is what the word bala signifies. So otherwise, and why I'm spending so much time in explaining bala, because usually whenever we hear this word bala, we always associate it with suppression. Because usually what happens is that whenever we speak of power, then at least in a worldly context, and at least when power goes into wrong hands, it is always misused. But in the context of yoga, strength has a very specific meaning. So, this was the first section in which the prayer was directed towards thriving. And prayers in Sanskrit are not simply prayers. We pray to create that mental state so that all our efforts, all that we do is guided by those prayers. That is why it is like making a conscious wish, and then we have to work in accordance. So that is this much was the first part. And one can say that this part of the prayer was very physical, because it was about the body, it was about the senses, it was about strength, it was about the different senses, it was about the different limbs of the body. But now, in the other three stages, the master goes deeper. In the next three stages, the master goes deeper. In the next section, he really presents the samam bonum, the quintessence of the Upanishadic teachings, the very goal, the purpose of why the body should be strengthened, why the body should thrive, why do we need this strength, why do we need it. So for this, he declares the very quintessence, the very goal, the realization that all this that we perceive through our senses is Brahman of the Upanishads. Now this needs to be explained. First of all, before we enter this new session, the next three steps are about the three yogas. And the three yogas, which all of us have heard, the first one is karma yoga, when our action is performed in such a way so that it leads to a meditative state. Yoga, as I repeatedly point out, in every master's understanding, may it be Patanjali or may it be any other master of yoga, in our last section, in our previous section, we saw how approximately at the time of Patanjali, or a little bit later of Patanjali, there were at least 5 traditions of yoga. The Sankhya tradition of yoga, of which Patanjali is a representative. Then there was the Vedantic tradition of yoga. There was the Buddhist tradition of yoga. There was the Jñāna tradition of yoga. And there was the Tantra, Agama tradition of yoga, as we clearly find being analyzed in this Jñāna text that I talked about in my previous session, Yoga Drishti Samuccaya, a compendium, a collection of all the different views on yoga, 6th, 7th century work. So, in all these different traditions, yoga had simply one meaning: meditation, a meditative state of mind. And anything that works as a means, as an instrument to achieve that meditative state, anything that is practiced as an instrument to reach that meditative, contemplative, peaceful state, that too is then called yoga. That's why asana, pranayama, all this is also called yoga. So when action is performed in such a way so that it becomes a means to evolve such a meditative state, then it is called karma yoga. Karma yoga is generally defined by yogic masters as actions of which the results is then shared with the divine, in other words, with everybody. So it's not every action has a result, but while the action is being performed, the desire is not to enjoy the result of that action by oneself, but simply to produce the effect so that it can be enjoyed by everyone, by everybody. So when action is performed with such a view, then it is called karma yoga. When a person practices the devotional path for the same purpose, to acquire a meditative state, because somehow meditation becomes very easy when the component of love is strengthened. When we love someone, then we naturally think about that person. Then we don't need to focus our mind, be attentive, be aware. All this happens very naturally when there is love, when there is. And bhakti, which we translate these days in English as devotion, and it would be interesting for me to see the derivation of the word devotion in English. But in Sanskrit, the word bhakti is simply defined as supreme love. That is how bhakti is defined by Bhakti Sutra, by texts, masters' teachings on bhakti. The second sutra there is Sattvasmin Parama Prema Swarupa. That is supreme love for this universal essence. So, supreme love, that is what bhakti. So and of course, again, love is not something that can be cultivated, but the idea is that as a result of karma yoga, as a result of performing selfless deeds, which means deeds without a selfish purpose, the heart becomes purified naturally on its own, so that this love, this bhakti evolves naturally within such a purified heart. And where there is love, there is understanding. So then comes the third yoga, Jñāna yoga, the yoga of wisdom, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of deep insight. These three words, which have become quite universal and can be found in all the yogic literature have been directly taken from the Bhagavad Gita. Patanjali uses slightly different words for these three. In Patanjali's teachings, Karma Yoga is Ishvara Pranidhana falling under Kriya Yoga, which is mentioned in the first sutra of the second chapter. Bhakti Yoga is Ishvara Pranidhana in the first chapter. So he speaks of two different Ishvara Pranidhanas. One is more active, which is Karma Yoga, and the one in the first chapter is more, it has the sense of devotion, the sense of love in it, in the first chapter, as a preparation for deeper states of meditation. And there he speaks of Bhakti. And his Ridambhara Prajna, his truth-bearing intelligence, his truth-bearing intellect, of which he speaks towards the end of the first chapter, that would be Jnana Yoga. Okay. Now, this mantra starts not with Karma Yoga, not with Bhakti Yoga, not with the means, but with the very final goal. By describing the very final goal for which I ask for my body and for my senses to be strengthened, and that is this declaration that we find, sarvaṁ brahmaupaniṣadam. This is an idea that has been expressed repeatedly in the context of meditation. In the Upanishadic teachings, what they say is, first of all, let me just briefly explain what Brahman means. Brahman, which is a word that comes again and again, and in the Upanishads, it is used for the supreme, because that is what Brahman in fact means. Brahma means to expand, to become big. And Brahman means the mightiest, the biggest. So, the infinite, you can call it the infinite. And because of one of the definitions that is found in the Upanishads, it is equated with omnipresent consciousness, which is seen by the Upanishadic masters as being even more subtle than space, than this space. Even space is understood to arise from that consciousness. So prajnanam, consciousness, is Brahman. That is, interestingly, grammatically, the word shunya, which is the Buddha's word and is explained as emptiness in the Buddhist teachings, and the Upanishadic word Brahman, which is explained in the Upanishadic teachings as that which fills up everything, Purna. We studied this when we were saying Purnamadah, Purnamidam. Interestingly, these two words grammatically mean exactly the same thing. Grammatically, the root of Shunya and the root of Brahman both mean to increase, to become big. And that's why grammatically Shunya too means exactly the same as Brahman. So it is very interesting, because even on a linguistic level, the Upanishads and the Buddha seem to be speaking of the same truth, but just the concepts related to that are different. So the Upanishadic practice of meditation is to sit down peacefully in a state of complete peace, by which the masters mean a state in which there is neither selfish attachment nor there is hatred. Two types of graspings that constantly take place. Even not only in our external life, but also when we sit down for meditation. Isn't that a good thought comes? Wow, a good thought. And since this good thought has come to me, I'm a good person. And then suddenly a very bad thought comes. This bad thought has come to me. What a bad person I am. So this kind of constant grasping, depending, because the mind flows on its own. Sometimes depending on which samskaras are present, and I can't even do anything about it. They just arise. I sit down in meditation and a thought arises. What can I do? Now, should I grasp it? Grasping means, should I engage with it? The masters would say that if a madman enters into this room, and if you unnecessarily engage with that person, he will stay longer. So just, he has come, let him be. He will be bored in a few minutes because Vedanta, the Upanishads are not for him. So then he will leave. So if you just remain a witness, it will pass. If we don't grasp. A grasp can be in both ways. Whether we say a good thought or whether we say a bad thought. Both we create ripples and then it remains. So the very idea of pratyahara in the way Vyasa explains it towards the end of the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras is to train, first of all, in the external world. When our senses touch their objects, we usually always define every object pleasurable and non-pleasurable. And if it's pleasurable, then we get attached to it, we want more of it, and if it's unpleasurable, if it doesn't give pleasure, or if it gives suffering, then we engage with it in a different way, that we start hating it. Patanjali's practice of pratyahara is to reduce this tendency first with external objects, so that the same then can be done with thoughts and ideas that arise within in meditation. In other words, just to be a witness. And so, Shantaha, that is when a person becomes a witness, doesn't grasp thoughts, to the thoughts that arise, to the emotions that arise, to the memories that arise. Otherwise, we will become deeply unsettled. That is what happens. Initially, many people, when they start sitting down for meditation, so many disturbing memories come up. Because there is so much chaos within. And that's why initially also yama, niyama, these practices, because they strengthen the good side, they organize the inner world so that chaos is reduced. Despite that beautiful organization of the inner world, still, whatever then comes up, the practice is to remain detached from that. Just a witness. A thought comes, let it pass, not engage with it. And from there, the next practice that the Upanishadic masters see is that all this that is arising within my consciousness is nothing but consciousness. So, despite all these different thoughts and ideas, to recognize the essence, which is the same. Every thought is a conscious thought. Can we think of an unconscious thought? Do we have an unconscious thought? Not that we can know of. There might be, it's very possible, I'm not saying. But we can't think, because every thought, we know of it only when we become conscious of it. And that's why every thought that arises and makes itself known to us has this component of consciousness in it. So then the practice is to shift from the content, which is changing from thought to thought. First thought might be about the Ganga, then the second thought might be about the flower flowing in the Ganga. The third thought might be about the person taking bath in the Ganga. The fourth thought might be about the person that is eating next to Ganga. And then the fifth thought might be about the pizza that I'm going to eat. And like this, the flow of thought continues to flow. But the content is changing from thought to thought. But something that hasn't changed and never changes in all our lives is that unchanging component, which is consciousness. So to cultivate an awareness of that, what a yogin then does in meditation, that sarvaṁ kalvidam brahma, all this that arises as thoughts in my meditation, that is nothing but Brahman, that is nothing but that pure consciousness. With the realization that every thought, this momentary thought, arises from consciousness, exists in consciousness, and dissolves back into consciousness. A thought comes, a bad thought. Yesterday he said something to me. I will see him. The thought comes. From where does it come? Even if it's not a wholesome thought, even if it's an agitating thought, even if it's an upsetting thought, from where does it arise? It arises from that thoughtless consciousness. It exists there in the light of that consciousness. And after a few moments, my thoughts change. Where has it gone? Back into that consciousness. So, the capacity to retain this awareness of consciousness itself, instead of the changing content, but in which it arises, that declaration has been presented here, sarvaṁ brahma. All this is Brahman. In the state of meditation, everything that arises in consciousness, all that is nothing but consciousness alone. This then leads to the two types of samādhi, deep absorptions that the Vedantic teachings speak of. One is absorption, where the thought is still present, savikalpa samādhi, and the second one is thoughtless absorption. The first one is defined as, for example, at the time of the master that gives this example, children used to play with animals made out of clay. So they had clay horses, they had clay elephants, they had clay cows, they had clay buffaloes, all different animals made out of clay. So he takes that as an example and says that when you look at all these different animals, and you see all these different animals, but with an awareness that all these are made from a single substance, the clay, of which maybe the child has no awareness. The child is simply interested. For a child, a lump of clay is not at all interesting. He still enjoys the shapes, the forms, the changing forms. That is what a child enjoys. So for him, clay is meaningless. For him, whether it is out of clay or out of plastic or out of whatever, a child doesn't care. For a child, the shape of the animal is exciting. someone with a deeper understanding, a child when it grows up a little bit and sees that, in essence, all of these are the same, they are made of the same clay, and is aware of the different forms, but is also aware of the underlying unity and oneness, both. When both awarenesses are there, awareness of duality, of difference, as well as an awareness of the underlying unity, that is what the Vedantic masters call as savikalpa samadhi, thoughtful absorption. And when a yogin completely transcends an awareness of the differences and just remains aware of the underlying unity of consciousness, and there is no more awareness of contents. The example usually they give is that this doesn't mean that the intellect is no more present, the mind is no more present. The mind doesn't die, it's not death, nor it is sleep, that the mind has fallen asleep. The mind simply merges, vanishes in the same way like salt vanishes into water. It is there, but it's not visible. A beautiful example. And take a lump of salt, which is very clearly visible, different, and put it into the water, and it merges. It doesn't get destroyed. So they are not speaking of destruction of the mind, but simply merging of the mind. When all these different thoughts, they are like that lump of salt. And when it merges into that consciousness, that is understood as nirvikalpa samadhi, thoughtless samadhi. The door to that in the Vedantic path, in the path of the Upanishads, is this realization and the constant awareness that all this that I'm perceiving is consciousness, which is my essence and which is the essence of everything else. So this is what is being declared here in sarvaṁ brahma Upanishadam. Sarvam, all this is Brahman of the Upanishads. Now what does of the Upanishads mean? It simply means Upanishad. What does first of all Upanishad means? Upanishad means to sit close. Shat means to sit. Shat, the root shat, means to sit. And upa means close and ni means down. So to sit down close. In other words, because Brahman has so many different meanings. Brahman can also stand for the Brahmin caste, a particular caste of scholars for whom the profession was to study these teachings and teach them. That was also, the word Brahman was also used for that sense. Brahman also meant the sacred teachings. The sacred teachings also, the Vedas, which means literally the four collections of teachings of extreme ancient India, which form the very foundation of spirituality on the Indian subcontinent. They are also referred to by the word Brahman. So Brahman can have many meanings, but by pointing out, I only mean Upanishada Brahman, the Brahman of the Upanishads, the Brahman that one experiences when one sits close to oneself, or when the Brahman that a person learns about when they sit close to their masters, to their teachers, that Brahman. So Upanishad. And that is why even when I started teaching the Upanishads, I spent many classes on explaining what Upanishads really are. And the quintessence of that was that Upanishads are not teachings, they are not books, but they are the wisdom that is present within them, and ultimately the wisdom that arises from within as a result of practicing according to those teachings, that inner direct wisdom, independent wisdom, which is completely independent from any book, from any other teaching, because Patanjali emphasizes tremendously for him Taraka Jñāna, the wisdom, the insight that can lead to the other shore of ignorance is not received wisdom, but is wisdom that arises from within. So such wisdom is referred to by Upanishad. So the Brahman of that wisdom. And I also pointed out that Upanishad is sometimes within the Upanishads themselves used as a synonym of yoga, as a synonym for meditation. In Chandogya Upanishad, one of the Upanishads, it is used in that sense. So it means also the Brahman that a person becomes aware of in the states of meditation. So all this is the Brahman of the Upanishads. Any questions on this? Any clarification that you would like me to give? Yes. Let it be big. Yes.
So if the good thing, and you said beneficial things can be remain and unbeneficial can be gone. So why people are using this alcohol and this addictive thing, which one is harmful?
Harmful. Harmful.
But they going more and more deeper and deeper. Even they know that this is the bad thing. They know this is not a good thing for themselves, but they going. How do you do
Yes.
according to this?
Yes. According this. According to this mantra. Okay.
What you mentioned.
Okay. Okay. I think this is there are two things. First of all, Duryodhana, the character of Mahabharata, precisely represents this problem. I know what is correct, I know what is dharma, but I am unable to engage myself in it. I know what is wrong, I know what is harmful, and yet I am unable to withdraw myself from it. And then, in the third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna precisely asks this question, that why then do we engage in harmful deeds? To this, the only answer that I can think of is the answer that Krishna gives, is desire. This constant desire. Even there, the desire for happiness, the desire to forget one's life's suffering is there. And that desire is what then throws us deeper and deeper. The desire to be happy is a fundamental human desire which should be explored, but there are ways of happiness which are beneficial, and there are ways of happiness which are not beneficial. And that's why the yogic masters create this distinction between priya, pleasant, and hita, which means beneficial, wholesome. Not everything pleasant is wholesome. Not everything pleasant. So everything that is pleasant has to be defined by that which is wholesome. And that's why even in the context of speaking the truth, the masters say that the idea is to speak a sweet truth, but not only sweet, but which is wholesome, beneficial. So, our desires lead us astray. That one beautiful, great yogin, Bhartrihari, he says that there is this beautiful saying by him, Kuranga matanga patanga meena bhringa naraha panchabhiranchita kim, which means Kuranga. Kuranga means deer. Matanga means elephant. Patanga means moth at night. Kuranga, matanga, patanga, meena, fish. And bhringa is the black beetle, like a bee, but the black beetle. And these 5, they get killed simply because of their desire for the object of one sense. Because in ancient India, hunters used to play flutes. Used to play a flute, and then the sound of that flute used to attract the deer, and then they used to come close, and then they used to kill them. So because of the desire of hearing beautiful sound, the deer gets killed. And matanga, the method in ancient India to catch wild elephants was to bring a female elephant and make a big hole, cover it with twigs, bind the female elephant there, and then the male elephant would come out from the forest and would fall into that hole, and then it would, very cruel, the elephant then was allowed to remain till it became very weak, and then when it became very weak, then it was controlled and domesticated. So simply the sense of touch, the desire for the sense of touch, leads the elephant there. And kuranga, matanga, patanga, moth, because it gets attracted by light and then gets killed by falling into the flame of fire. Fish, we all know, can catch it by food. So taste, sense of taste. And about bhringa, it was that it gets attracted by, even honeybees, they get attracted by the smell of blooming flowers. And then what happens is that in most cases they get nourished. But in some cases, sometimes what happens, and yogis have described this, that honeybee goes to a lotus and then it becomes dark and the lotus closes and the honeybee, or the bhringa, the black huge beetle bee which you have in India, it gets trapped in it for the whole night and has to remain there. And sometimes what happens is that if at night the elephants come and they to drink water and to play in the water, they destroy those lotuses, and with that also the beetle got killed. So like this, each one of these 5 simply, so it's not even about pursuing them, it's about the desire, again this inner, which also the Buddha sees as the fundamental causes of all suffering, and Patanjali sees as the cause of suffering. That desire ultimately becomes the very source. So, and then of course addiction, mental addiction plays also a role. We become completely, first of all, we pursue those narcotic elements out of desire to find peace, because we all want peace, but peace is difficult to achieve. So either you achieve a very easy to achieve peace and then experience the negative results, or work hard to achieve that peaceful state of mind. which is what yoga is about. And then we get dependent. We get really dependent on those. That is why the most important, Patanjali is also looking for happiness. Everybody is looking for happiness. Everybody is looking for inner peace. But what sets yogis apart is simply that they are looking for a kind of happiness which is independent, which is not dependent on something external, which is not dependent. We all can be happy if our happiness is dependent on pleasant objects. Then but such happiness will be momentary. Then when that object is no more, when that object is taken away by someone else, when that object is destroyed, or when that object, simply because the law of nature is that everything changes. So when that object changes, becomes something different, then it then leads to suffering. So rather than swinging to and fro from these moments of suffering and happiness to all of their lives, the goal of a yogin is to find happiness which is independent from any external objects. Happiness that can remain even in the painful moments of life. And it is possible. I mean, for example, look at a mother. When she gives birth, she has to go through tremendous pain, tremendous suffering, but she goes through it with tremendous happiness, because the end result is happiness. She becomes happy, extremely proud for giving birth to that child. So even though suffering is there, that suffering does not depress her, but ultimately because she has a reason to be happy. So what this shows us is that someone can be happy even in moments of physical suffering. So this gives them hope, and they look for such internal happiness which can be retained to train one's body-mind apparatus in such a way so that peace and happiness can be found in and can be retained in all the difficult moments of life. In peaceful moments as well as in the moments of restlessness. That is what sets a yogin apart from other heathens who are just in search for momentary happiness. So, that would be a momentary. That's why Patanjali speaks of elixir of happiness. Actual elixir, aushadha, janmaushadhi manpratapa samādhi jaha siddhaya. He speaks of those elixir that can lead one into happy states. But Vyasa quickly adds that such elixirs are only found in the kingdoms of demons, asuras, those who pursue momentary happiness of the senses. Because in the Sanskrit word asura, which is translated as demons, simply has a simple meaning. Asu means senses, and ra means the one who enjoys through the senses, which means that he still has not found a way to enjoy oneself without being dependent on the senses. And demonic qualities result if a person takes this idea to the extreme and says that at any cost, I just want to keep my pleasures intact. That is then depending on how much power and strength such a person has in this world. He becomes a smaller demon, a bigger demon. Tyrants are the biggest demons because they don't care. Asura is simply a person for whom the goal of life is the fulfillment of the senses, no matter what. If others suffer, he doesn't care. such a person is an asura, which then we translate as demon. But dvau bhuta sargau lokesmin daiva asura evacha, Krishna in the 16th chapter expresses very beautifully that these beings, which means these human beings, have been created in two types. Daiva, the radiant ones, the gods, and asura, the demonic ones. They exist within everyone, within every human being. These tendencies exist, depending on which one we allow to govern ourselves. That is what we become. Either we become gods or we become demons. And if we fall somewhere in between, then we are human beings. Yes.
What is the response of the yogi to an asura in the face of injustice?
In the face of injustice, yes. Depending on the duties that a yogi has taken upon himself, first of all, there are two types of injustice: injustice against oneself and injustice against others. Injustice against oneself, the yogic response to that, depending on the strength that a yogi has developed, is upeksha, the fourth one of the Brahma Viharas. Upeksha, which can be explained as forgiveness. Maybe somebody has been unjust towards me, I forgive that person. Now this again depends how much strength I have developed to be able to remain with forgiveness and how far I can take this forgiveness. Yogis have gone to extreme lengths in this practice of forgiveness. That is one thing. Now, when indifference is happening to others, then what should be done? That is the big question. Should their forgiveness, should one practice forgiveness there? There then, the yogic view would be, you have to look at your duty. What is your duty towards the society? What have you chosen as your duty towards the society? If you have chosen it for yourself as a duty to protect the society from injustice, then such a person in that moment has to stand up and fight against, but only against, such injustice to protect those who suffer as a result of injustice. So Gita has to be seen, Gita's teachings have to be seen in that context. So there are two approaches: injustice towards oneself. Yoga would encourage forgiveness. Injustice towards others. Now, what is your duty? You have to ask, what is your dharma? What is your duty? And if you think that it is your duty to protect injustice, then you have to stand up. Not everybody might feel that way. This was never a society where everybody had to go and fight. A certain group was there. Even today, a certain group was there. If everybody starts protecting righteousness, then again, problems. Then you get problems when people start taking the law in their hands. So not everybody should be encouraged to stand up in that sense. So a particular group who has taken it as their duty for them, yes. Himsa, even sometimes, even the Buddha had to accept that sometimes there is not to attack someone, not to cause suffering, but if we are being attacked, then of course, to save others. A king's duty, first of all, is to stand up, and even if he has to get killed, then they have to get killed. So these are the two approaches that one would have. But again, yes.
So you said that I don't know if the name in English quintessence of the Upanishads is that all is Brahma.
Yes, quintessence of the very quintessential message of the Upanishads is sarvaṁ khalvidam Brahma. All this is pure consciousness. That's, yes.
So you talked about asura being somebody who is driven by the senses.
Who is driven by the desire to fulfill sense pleasure. Yes.
But when we look at our mythology and we see the devas, there too we talk about pleasures like
Yes.
apsaras,
Yes.
soras.
Yes.
How does that differ?
Yes. How does that differ? Yes. They are the heavenly pleasures which in the context of meditation, even the pleasure, the ananda that arises within in the deeper states of meditation is a person has to detach oneself from them. The devas, why they are different, in what sense they are different from the asuras, is that they also pursue and they are deeply attached towards their senses, but they have not left dharma. They have not left righteousness. Their pleasures, they are still, you see, in the context of Vedanta, in the context of the Upanishads, when we speak of transcending goodness as well as badness, so asuras represent that badness, but even goodness, and devas represent that goodness, that still they are on the path of good, they are completely on the path of good, but they are still engaged in the enjoyments of their good deeds. So they are still a step lower than a Buddha, an awakened person who has transcended both. So while an asura pursues sense pleasure for no matter what, the devas pursue sense pleasure but with a sense of righteousness.
They have some boundaries.
They have boundaries. They certainly, that's why they are devas. That's why they are in the heavens up there and not in the hells down there like the asuras. They enjoy their enjoyments without having inflicted suffering on others. But even there, Sankhya, the yogis, would say that whatever they have done, some little bit of injustice must have happened. Some little bit of suffering must have been caused, because one cannot develop and one cannot cultivate enjoyment 100% by not causing injustice or suffering to anyone else. And that's why sometimes in between they also have to suffer. They also get attacked. Mythological stories. They also get attacked from the heavens. They run away. They have to hide themselves in the Himalayan mountains. They lose heaven, fall down. All this happens. Because still. And so they are also enjoying the senses, but they are enjoying it rightfully. In fact, the whole idea of the four purusharthas, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, these four, dharma comes in the very beginning so that it can define how we cultivate artha, which means wealth, and how we fulfill our desires, which is kama. Dharma comes in the beginning. So if one follows that precept and one fulfills one's desires by not moving away from dharma, then he is a deva. Deva of a lower category, not Mahadeva, not the great deva. The great deva comes when a person goes deeper into the that is Lord Shiva in mythologies. Okay, I think let's leave it here and we will come back to this discussion. This section today was sarvaṁ brahmaupaniṣadam, was Jñāna yoga, and then we will come to karma yoga and bhakti yoga in our next section. Let us conclude with the prayer for universal well-being. Om सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु भवेत् ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः